Wyoming Territory, 1879. The wind kicked up dust across the high plains as the sun sank low, bleeding red across the sky, and Avalon O'Dare clutched the handle of the Colt .45 with shaking fingers. Her breath came hard and fast. Blood roared in her ears. The man at her feet, Sheriff Leonard, groaned once before going still, his chest unmoving. She had not meant to shoot him. She had only meant to scare him off. He had cornered her in the back of the general store, his breath sour with whiskey, his hands grabbing where they had no right to go. The world tilted and her knees gave out. She dropped beside him, her dress spreading like spilled ink across the dirt. Behind her, the door swung open. Avalon. The voice was deep, steady, familiar. She looked up and saw Vallen Thorne standing in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, the last light of day catching in his dark brown hair. His eyes landed on the blood, the gun in her hand, and the man on the ground. He did not ask a single question. Instead, Vallen moved fast. He grabbed the Colt from her hand and tucked it into his belt. Then he knelt beside the sheriff, checked for a pulse, and stood. "He is dead," Vallen said quietly. Avalon's lips trembled. "I tried to stop him. He came after me. I did not mean, I know." Vallen's gaze met hers. "But no one else will believe you," she shook her head. "There has to be a way, there is." He pulled her to her feet, dusted off her skirt with shaking hands, and then turned toward the street. "Go home, do not speak a word, let me handle this." Her heart dropped. "Vallen, what are you doing?" But he was already walking out the door, dragging the sheriff's body behind him. The next day, Vallen Thorne confessed to the murder of Sheriff Leonard. He claimed the sheriff had caught him stealing liquor from the store's back room. They had fought, and in the struggle, the gun had gone off. Avalon stood frozen in the back of the courthouse as the judge ordered him held in the Cheyenne jail until trial. He never looked toward her once, but she could see it in the set of his jaw, the way he stood tall. He was protecting her. And he would hang for it. That night, Avalon packed a small satchel, saddled her mare, and rode out of town. She had not always been alone. Her mother had died when she was young, her father when she was 16. Now 22, she had been working at the store to make ends meet. She had no family left. Except Vallen. He had been her father's ranch hand once, their quiet neighbor after the cattle fever took most of the herd. They had grown up side by side. He taught her to ride, to shoot, and once, at 17, kissed her behind the hayloft. She had never forgotten. Now he was in jail for her. She would not let that stand. She rode south through the night, stopping only to water the horse. By dawn, her plan was clear. There had been a witness, a man named Clive Danner, who had seen the sheriff follow her into the store and walked away. He had left town that same night, heading toward Colorado Territory. If she could find Clive, bring him back, he could clear Vallen's name. 3 days passed in a blur of dust and saddle sores. She slept under the stars, ate jerky from her pack, and followed every whispered lead through small towns and camps. No one had seen Clive until she reached a mining settlement near the border. "He was here," the barkeep said, wiping down the counter. "Caused some trouble over cards, left 2 nights ago, headed toward the Apache lands, I heard." Avalon's heart thudded. "Apache," the man nodded. "Said he was going to trade whiskey for silver." "Fool." The next morning, she rode west, straight into the mountains, where the land grew wilder and the trails thin. She had heard stories about the Mescalero Apache who still moved through these parts, about their fierce protection of their land, but none of it mattered. She would ride any trail to save Vallen. It was nearly dusk when they found her. The first arrow thudded into the tree beside her. Her mare reared, and Avalon barely stayed in the saddle. A voice shouted from the rocks ahead. "Drop the gun and dismount," she froze. The voice was male, calm but firm. "I am not here to fight," she called out. "I am looking for someone." Another voice, closer now. "Dismount now." She slid off the mare, hands up. The man who stepped from the rocks was young, maybe 25, with sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that watched her like a hawk. He wore a worn leather vest and carried a bow across his back. His stance was wary but not cruel. "My name is Avalon O'Dare," she said, her voice steady. "I am looking for a man named Clive Danner. He said he was coming this way." The man stepped forward, his fingers twitching near the knife at his belt. "You are far from your town, Avalon O'Dare," she nodded. I need to find Clive. He saw something. Something that could save someone's life. He studied her face, then motioned to the trees. You will come with me. They walked in silence for nearly an hour. The sky turned purple above them. She tried to keep pace, but her legs were sore and her breath came fast. Do you have a name? She asked finally. He glanced back. Tavoran, do you know where Clive is? Yes, she stopped walking. Then take me to him. Tavoran turned fully to her. In the fading light, his face was unreadable. He is a prisoner. Avalon's heart dropped. He stole from our camp. Whiskey, tried to trade it for a woman. She swallowed hard. Will you let me speak to him? Tavoran paused. Why should I? She stepped closer. Because the man I love is going to hang for a crime he did not commit. Clive saw what really happened. He is the only one who can clear his name. Tavoran's expression shifted. He looked at her longer this time, as if weighing something. You love this man, her voice broke. Yes, Tavoran nodded once. Then you will come. But if you lie to me, I am not lying. He turned again and walked ahead. She followed. They reached the camp by nightfall. Fires glowed between the trees. People watched her with quiet curiosity but did not stop her. Tavoran led her to a small shelter where Clive sat bound, his face bruised and eyes swollen. Avalon stepped forward. Clive, do you remember me? He blinked. Avalon, you saw what happened in the store with the sheriff. You saw him follow me. He looked away. I did not see anything else. That does not matter. Just say you saw him follow me, that he was drunk, that he had a reputation. He hesitated. And what? They will believe that. They have to. She forced the words out. Please, he took the blame for me. You can set it right. Tavoran watched from the doorway. After a long pause, he said, He will speak. I will bring him. Avalon turned to him, her eyes wide. You will. I believe you, he said simply. That night she sat by the fire, hands wrapped around a tin cup as Tavoran sat across from her. His voice was softer now. You rode far for him. I would ride farther, she said. He is the best man I know. Tavoran nodded once. Then we ride at dawn, and they did. The trail east from the Mescalero camp rode hard beneath their horses. Tavoran led, Clive tied by the wrists and roped to his saddle, Avalon riding just behind. The air grew thinner as they climbed into the foothills. Pines broke the monotony of sage and stone, and birdsong flickered through the hush of dawn. Avalon hadn't spoken since they broke camp. Her throat ached from the dry wind and sleepless night, but more than that, she couldn't force her voice past the tightness in her chest. Tavoran hadn't asked questions. He rode with a quiet purpose, checking the trail, adjusting Clive's lead, never once looking back at her. It wasn't until the sun reached its highest point that he finally slowed beside a stream and dismounted. We rest. Avalon slid from her saddle, her legs unsteady. She crouched by the water, splashed her face, and drank deep. The cold shocked her back to herself. She wiped her mouth and turned toward him. Why are you helping me? Tavoran crouched beside a patch of dry grass, picking at it. You didn't lie, that matters. That can't be the only reason. He looked up. It isn't, but it's the first one. She waited, but he said no more. Clive had slumped forward, silent since morning. She didn't offer him water. Tavoran rose, brushing his palms together. There's another trail east. We'll take it less watched. Avalon stood. You know these paths well. I grew up near here. My aunt taught me how to track elk in these hills. She studied him for a moment. You left your people to help a stranger. I didn't leave. I said I would return. She hesitated. Do they trust you'll come back? He nodded once. They know my word. They rode again before the sun began to dip. The trail narrowed, winding between rock outcrops and low brush. Avalon's horse stumbled once, and Tavoran turned without speaking, steadying the reins until the mare righted herself. She said, You didn't ask what I'd do if Clive refuses to speak. I already know you'd find another way. They rode in silence after that. By nightfall, they reached the edge of a small rancher's settlement, barely more than a blacksmith, a boarding house, and a rail spur. Smoke drifted from a chimney, and a dog barked somewhere in the dark. Tavoran led them behind a line of cottonwoods near the creek and made a small fire low to the ground. Avalon sat on a flat stone, watching the flames lick at dry pine. Her arms ached. Her back was tight from the saddle. Still, she didn't want to sleep. Tavoran handed her a strip of dried meat. She took it without a word. He settled beside her, legs crossed, elbows on his knees. "What was he to you, the one in jail?" She didn't answer right away. The fire threw soft light on Tavoran's face, outlining the strong line of his jaw, the small line between his brows. "He was kind when no one else was," she said. "After my father died, the neighbors turned cold. They saw me alone and they saw weakness, but Vallen didn't. He brought fence wire when the wind tore down the posts. He fixed the roof after the hail. He never asked for anything." Tavoran nodded. "And now you give everything?" "I owe him more than my life." He looked down at his hands. "Men like that don't come often." "No," she said softly. "They don't." Clive stirred behind them, shifting against his bindings. "You two going to talk all night?" he muttered. Tavoran glanced over his shoulder. "You're welcome to sleep." "I'll speak," Clive said. "When we get to Cheyenne, I'll say what I saw." Avalon didn't answer. She didn't trust the ease in his voice, not yet. Later, when the fire had burned low and the stars lay thick above them, Tavoran pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders and said, "When this is over, what will you do?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I never thought past saving him." He looked toward the trees. "You'll need something after." She tucked her knees beneath her and leaned closer to the warmth. "And you, what waits for you when you go back?" My uncle's heard, a half-built cabin. "My sister wants me to take a wife." Avalon glanced at him, surprised. "Do you want that?" He didn't look away from the fire. "I want someone who fights for the people they love." The quiet that followed settled deep. It wasn't awkward, it breathed with something new, something tender that hadn't been there before. In the morning, they would ride again. Tomorrow, they'd reach Cheyenne. But for now, the fire warmed more than just their hands. They reached the outskirts of Cheyenne by mid-afternoon. The city crouched low beneath a sky bruised with storm clouds. Wind tugged at the edges of Avalon's coat, and the horses moved slower now, their breath steaming. Tavoran shifted in the saddle beside her, his gaze fixed on the rooftops ahead, where chimneys coughed smoke and the courthouse bell rang once, deep and distant. Clive rode tethered behind them, his head down, shoulders hunched against the cold. He hadn't spoken since dawn, and Avalon had no urge to press him. The truth would come soon enough. As they passed the stockyards, the scent of manure and iron filled the air. A rancher glanced up from a wagon load of fence posts, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Clive bound. Tavoran nodded once in acknowledgement, but kept riding. They dismounted behind the livery stable, where the trail dusted off into puddles and boot prints. Avalon led her mare inside and handed off the reins to a boy barely old enough to see over the gate. When she turned, Tavoran was already untying Clive's wrists. "I'll take him in," Avalon said. Tavoran's brow lifted. "You sure?" "He won't bolt. Not with me." Clive rubbed at the raw skin on his wrists. "Wasn't planning on it anyhow." They walked the last stretch in silence, past the dry goods store, the tin-roofed saloon, and a woman sweeping the steps of the boarding house with a rhythm that echoed down the street. The courthouse stood straight-backed at the end of Main, its white clapboard exterior clean despite the mud. A marshal leaned against the rail outside, rifle across his chest. Avalon stepped forward. "I need to speak with Judge Harlan." "It's about the Thorne case." The marshal's eyes flicked to Clive. "Name, Clive Danner. He has testimony that proves Vallen Thorne's innocence." The marshal studied her a moment longer, then shoved the door open. "Inside, wait on the left." Inside, the air smelled of ink and old paper. The judge's clerk, a thin man with a crooked collar, led them into a side room with a stove burning low and a single chair set in the middle. The judge arrived minutes later, his hair grayer than Avalon remembered, his boots polished beneath a frayed cuff. "You've got 1 minute," he said, settling against the desk. "Make it count." Avalon stepped back as Clive dragged the chair forward and sat. He didn't look at her. His voice was quiet, flat. "I saw Sheriff Leonard follow Avalon into the storeroom. He was drunk. I heard her shout, didn't go in." "Figured it wasn't my business." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Go on." "Then I heard the shot. I ran like a coward, didn't want trouble, but she didn't kill him out of hate. Man was known for laying hands on women. Everyone knew it. We just kept quiet." Judge Harlan studied him for a moment. Then he turned to Avalon. Thorne claimed it was a fight over liquor. He lied, she said, to protect me. The judge didn't respond at once. He crossed the room, pulled a thin folder from the shelf, and flipped it open. After a moment, he said, "I'll call for the marshal." Thorne's release will be signed by sundown. Avalon's knees gave a little. She reached for the edge of the table and held it tight. Outside, the wind had picked up. Tavoran stood beneath the awning, arms crossed. When he saw her, he stepped forward. "It's done," she said. His eyes searched hers. "He's free, soon." They walked back toward the stable without speaking. When they reached the edge of town, Avalon stopped beside the fence and rested her hands on the top rail. A crow called from the eaves of the saloon behind them. She turned to Tavoran. "I don't know how to repay you. You don't owe me. I want to, not because I have to, because I need to." Tavoran stepped closer, his coat brushing hers in the wind. "I won't stay in Cheyenne," he said. "I've got people waiting. Land that needs tending." "I don't belong here either," she said. "Not anymore." They stood like that for a long moment, the silence between them easy now, filled with something that didn't need words. Then Tavoran reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. "My sister's place, outside of Ruidoso, if you ever get tired of the cold." She took it, her fingers brushing his. "What if I don't wait?" He met her eyes. "Then I'll be there." The courthouse doors opened behind them. Vallen stepped out, blinking into the light, his figure thinner than before, his face drawn. He looked toward Avalon and smiled. She walked to him, wrapped her arms around his waist, and leaned her head against his chest. He held her tightly, his breath catching once before he let it out slow. "Clive told the truth," she said softly. He nodded. "I knew he would. Once you found him." She drew back just enough to look at him. "I would have gone farther if I had to." "I know," he said. "And I've never loved you more for it." She turned once, just enough to find Tavoran still standing by the fence, watching them. Later, when the horses were saddled and the sun dipped behind the ridge, Avalon stood between the two men who had changed her life, one who had saved her, and one she had saved in return. She reached for Vallen's hand. "Let's go home," she said, and they did. Avalon stepped down from the wagon and blinked against the early evening light. The house looked smaller than she remembered. The boards had silvered from years of wind, and the porch sagged slightly on the left side, same as it had the last time Vallen repaired it. The cottonwoods beyond had thickened, roots pushing up through the soil like knuckles. She stood still for a long breath, the quiet pressing in around her. Vallen came up behind her, his hand resting lightly at her back. "Still want this place?" he asked. She nodded, but didn't speak. Her throat was tight. She walked up the porch steps and ran her fingers along the rail. The nails had rusted, but the wood still held. She heard Vallen unhook the latch behind her, the creak of the door swinging open. Inside, dust hung in the slanted light. The chairs were where they'd left them. The table still bore the long scratch from when her father had dropped the branding iron. The iron stove crouched cold against the wall. Avalon crossed to the window and opened it wide. Outside, the wind moved through the grass like breath. Behind her, Vallen set down his pack. "We'll need to patch the back wall before snowfall. I'll clean the chimney tomorrow," she said, brushing absently at the sill, "and check the root cellar." He stepped closer. "You plan to stay then?" She turned to him. He looked thinner now, the weeks in jail having carved new lines at the corners of his mouth, but his eyes held the same steadiness. Her own hands still bore the faint marks from the rains, and the coat she wore had one torn cuff from the ride through the pines. "I didn't ride all that way to leave again," she said. He nodded once and looked down at his boots. "I wasn't sure after everything." "I was." They stood there, the room catching the last light of day. Avalon reached out and took his hand, his fingers curled into hers, slow and certain. Later, she built a fire while he unpacked the tools from the barn. The axe handle had cracked, but the blade was sharp. She watched him from the doorway as he knelt by the chopping block, the rhythm of his work even. The sky behind him burned with the last of the sunset. They ate beside the hearth, bread warmed on the stove and beans boiled with a bit of dried onion. Avalon sat cross-legged on the floor, her back to the wall. Vallen leaned against the edge of the hearth, legs stretched out, his hair damp from washing. I never asked, he said quietly. What it cost you, finding him? She traced a knot in the floorboard with her thumb. A part of me I wasn't using anymore. He looked at her, waiting. The part that thought I had to keep paying for surviving, she said. It's gone now. He didn't speak, just reached across the space and took her hand again. His thumb moved once, slow over her knuckles. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters. The fire cracked low. I want to build a fence, he said after a while. South pasture's wide enough to hold more cattle come spring, she nodded. We'll need to dig the posts deep. The frost'll heave them otherwise. He glanced at her and something passed between them, quiet, certain. He said softly. She met his gaze. Yes, he shifted, drawing closer, his voice low. You don't have to promise anything, not yet. I already did, she said, when I chose to ride. There was no rush in the way he leaned toward her, no urgency in the way she closed the distance. When their mouths met, it was steady and warm like the first sun after a hard snow. His hand rested at her waist. Her fingers curled at his collar. After they sat side by side, her head on his shoulder, the fire dying to coals. The silence between them held no weight now, only ease. In the morning, they would clear the ashes, mend the roof, and begin again. But tonight, the house was warm, and for the first time in a long while, so were they. Avalon woke to the sound of chickens scratching near the porch. The light filtering through the window was pale, early soft enough to cast long slants on the wooden floor. She lay still a moment, her cheek against Vallen's shoulder, the steady rise and fall of his breath grounding her in the quiet morning. He shifted slightly, his arm tightening around her waist. You hearing that too? He said, voice rough with sleep. She smiled against his skin. They're yours now, you let them live here. Vallen gave a low chuckle. They came with the land. She sat up, pulling the wool blanket around her shoulders. The air had a bite to it, and the fire had gone out during the night. She rose and crossed to the hearth, kneeling to coax the embers back to life. Vallen joined her, crouched beside the stove, feeding in a few pine shavings. We'll need to split more wood today, he said. Only have enough for a few more nights, the way the wind's been. We can do that after breakfast. I'll check the henhouse to make sure nothing burrowed in. He nodded and pushed himself to standing. I'll see about the well. The pump handle's been stiff since we got back. They moved through the morning with a rhythm that didn't need naming. She swept out the corners of the kitchen while he carried buckets from the well to fill the wash basin. By the time they sat down to eat, the sun was warming the western side of the house, and the wind had died down. While they ate, Vallen glanced at her in that quiet way he had, like he was measuring something inside her rather than what she said aloud. I never asked you before, he said, tearing a piece of bread in half. What did you dream about before everything? When you were younger. Avalon chewed slowly, then set her fork down. I wanted to run a school, just a small one, teach out of a one-room cabin, maybe with a garden out front, nothing grand, just a place where children could read and not be afraid of their own voices. He nodded, thoughtful. You never said. I didn't think anyone wanted to hear it. I do. She looked at him, eyes steady. What about you? He leaned back in his chair. I used to think about raising horses, breeding them for work, not for show. The kind that could handle long winters and bad roads. You still could, she said. We've got room, I know. They cleared the dishes in silence. When Vallen stepped outside to start on the woodpile, Avalon lingered near the window, watching him. He worked with quiet focus, each swing of the axe deliberate. She saw the way he paused between strokes, adjusting his stance when the log didn't split clean. He didn't rush anything. That steadiness that had saved her more than once. A few days later, a wagon rolled in from the north road, its wheels thick with mud. Inside sat a woman in her 40s, her bonnet pulled low, and a boy beside her no older than 10. The woman's name was Ruth Kessler. She'd heard a widow's place had opened up near the creek, and she'd come to ask if the spare cabin in the back pasture was habitable. Avalon walked her out to the old bunkhouse, showed her the roof patches and the dry stove. Ruth ran her hands over the worn windowsill and nodded. I can fix it up. Just need a place where no one raises their voice. You'll have it, Avalon said. They helped her settle in over the next 2 days. Ruth brought bread as thanks, and her son, Nathaniel, followed Vallen around with wide eyes, watching him mend the fence and feed the mare. The boy asked questions, always quiet, always polite. Vallen didn't speak much in return, but he let the boy stay close. That was enough. One morning, as Avalon stitched a tear in Vallen's coat, he said, "That schoolhouse you talked about. There's space between here and the Kessler's place." Flat ground, good sunlight. She looked up. "You think I should?" "I think you already are. That boy's been carrying a book under his arm every day since he arrived. I haven't taught him anything yet. You gave him a place where he can want to learn." "That's more than most." She set the coat aside and crossed to where he stood. "If I build it, I want it to be part of this place, not separate. It will be. Everything we build from now on is ours." His words settled deep. She reached for his hand. "I'm not used to having something that lasts," he squeezed gently. "You do now." The first frost came early that year. The fields wore a silver crust in the mornings, and the breath from the horses hung thick in the air. They stacked firewood high beneath the lean-to and sealed the windows tight. Avalon began teaching Nathaniel 3 mornings a week at the kitchen table while the bunkhouse was cleared out for desks and shelves. On the day the first snow fell, Vallen came in with his shoulders dusted white. He shook off his coat and crossed the room to where she stood near the stove. "I built something," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Another gate." He took her hand and led her outside. The snow was falling soft and straight, and beyond the porch, near the cottonwoods, stood a small post and beam shelter. Inside it, a wooden bench and a low table. On the table, a carved box with her name burned into the lid. She stepped in, brushing snow from her shoulders, and opened the box. Inside lay a bound notebook, its pages blank. "For your school," he said. "For your words." She turned to him, her eyes bright with tears she didn't try to hide. "You built this for me. We built this life together," he said. "This is just part of it." She stepped into his arms, the cold forgotten. He held her close, his breath warm against her temple. "I love you," she said. His voice was quiet. "Sure, I know." "And I love you." That winter, they worked side by side, her teaching from the bunkhouse by day, him tending the land and horses before dusk. Ruth helped with the sewing, and Nathaniel became the first pupil to read aloud in Avalon's school. The days were short, but they were full. And for the first time, everything Avalon had once dreamed felt not only possible, but real. In the spring, wildflowers crept back across the pasture, and Vallen planted a row of young saplings along the fence line. The roots would take time, but they would hold. By then, Avalon had filed the paperwork to register the school, formerly Riverside Schoolhouse, named for the stream that ran through the back field. More children arrived with their mothers, and Ruth helped take on lessons when Avalon needed time in the garden or by Vallen's side. One morning, as they stood watching the sunrise from the porch, Avalon took Vallen's hand. "I didn't think I'd get to have this." He looked at her, quiet and steady as ever. "You made it with your own hands." She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "I think we both did." And they stayed together through the seasons, through the years to come. In a life they built with care and quiet strength, where the past no longer chased them and the future stretched wide and warm ahead.